it's a digital world. Information is inert. It has zero value until you can provide context. You can only provide context if you have some kind of intent. And that's the conscious effort that you put into something because it has value. So the moment all these things come together, then everything changes again.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is my friend David Amerland, and we're going to do a bit of a random checking in, sort of catching up kind of show. So we'll see where the conversation takes us. David, welcome back to the show.
Shaun, I'm delighted to reconnect with you.
So I looked it up this morning, and it's been 20 months since our last conversation. Give us a few highlights. What have you been up to? What have we missed out on in the life of David Amerland?
Oh, wow. I didn't even realize it's been that long.
It has been.
Okay, it's been a bit crazy. Over the last 2 years, I've done a lot of international talks promoting my last book, which is A Sniper Mind. I've done a little bit of consulting for companies, talking to their executives about decision-making, again, based on my last book, and troubleshooting some of the things which they have actually been coming across. And they've been using me as a sounding board mostly to see if there's a change of direction they need to take. And that's been really, really interesting. And at the back of that, I'll be doing my usual work in consulting with search and marketing, working on my next book, which I can't talk about just yet, and doing articles for Inc. and Forbes and so on.
It's been interesting to kind of get to know your online persona. I mean, we had a great conversation a little less than 2 years ago, and we've exchanged a range of emails and Twitter messages since then. And so I have my impression of who I think you are, yet I barely know you. So let's do a dive and see what I can find out. So overall, David, I would say you strike me as somebody who's a bit of a high achiever. And so I'm curious for you, how do you break things down? Like when it comes to being organized and prioritizing things, say on a daily basis, a weekly, a monthly basis. I just know you're a guy who has a bunch of things you're juggling always. So how do you make that work?
It's fascinating how people see you, right? Because, inside my skin, I'm constantly struggling with things. I'm constantly learning. And as a process, I constantly feel stupid because I'm tackling new things and the learning curve is steep and you're never 100% sure you're actually doing it. So I'm doing it correctly. So, I feel anything but a high achiever. I am constantly curious and I'm constantly going to the next thing. And funnily enough, all those things are connected, going from search to marketing to, communication to decision-making. All those things which used to be compartmentalized are now suddenly interlinked. And these are the sort of challenges we face. And these are challenges which I face every day. Every time I go into either a company or talk to executives or go into some sort of public speaking situation, there's a relative element of unknowing ability because I don't know what they're going to ask specifically. I try to deliver value within that context. I have to imagine what their touch points really are in terms of their concerns and so on. I have to create some kind of granularity in my approach. And then when they ask questions, I have to try and dig deep in my well of knowledge and experience and try to actually make sense. And that's my reality. That's what actually drives me. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I'm going to come back to this later because I've got another question that will springboard off of that. But another thing I've been wondering about, are you more of a, like when it comes to collecting your thoughts, brainstorming, are you a paper journal kind of guy or an electronic journal sort of guy? Like for me, there are certain things that I only put in a Moleskine. It's a journal that I keep and I refer back to that stuff often. And that's very different than the things I'm saving in email or on a Google Doc. And so I kind of have different things that go in different places. Like for you, paper journal, electronic, what do you use?
It's fascinating. While I fully appreciate the writing process on paper essentially and how it slows you down, and there's a lot of value to that. From a very practical point of view, because I moved around a lot, I had to spend a lot of time on airports and so on. I had to go digital some time ago, and that some time ago for me was 2010. So I've been fully digital for 9 years now. I don't use any paper. And I have, if you ask me the last time you've actually written something on paper, gosh, it has to be at least 8 years ago because I don't, I sign books and I sign contracts and so on, but, that's not writing. So actually having a pen, I don't even have a pen anymore. Wherever I go, somebody says, have you got a pen on you? I don't. So I have to borrow one. So yeah, it's fully digital. And because of that, and it's a practical thing, I made the choice consciously, and it was a big wrench. And to sort of show you what kind of wrench it was, in my previous life, I had a collection of 3,500 books on paper. And more or less every time I changed country, they came with me. At great cost, but there's a great value to that, because some of those books I had to hunt for ages, and some they had memories attached, and every time you see them, all those things, right? And then I decided that, I couldn't just keep doing that, and I had to stop. And, my house isn't big enough for, wall-to-wall sort of bookshelf, which I needed. So I digitized everything. I carry everything with me on my phone and on my tablet. And it was a huge wrench, and I missed it. Moving into the digital realm, I have had to consciously look for the benefits because I was missing paper so much. So basically, I've really made it work for me. They're with me everywhere. I've made annotations. I've got notes on every book. I have cross-referenced my own library, and every new book I read, I sort of keep notes on that, and those notes on the web, because they go on either, depending on how you make them, they go either on Google Keep or they go on Google Drive, and you can access them very quickly. So I've made that actually work for me. So I'm fully digital, and I try to use the capacity that digital gives me to actually become better. And in many ways, I'm thinking with a brain outside my head, and that gives me an extra edge.
From a sort of crossing the threshold with that sort of a change, what was harder? Was it giving up some of your persona and identity that was tied up in those books as things that you had experiences and emotional connections to? Or was it harder to shift so many of your thought processes when it comes to not necessarily the books, but paper and writing? And which was harder, your emotions or your functional process?
It was both, because the way you operate is tied into who you think you are. So let's say that an aspect of my identity was tied into the ownership of 3,500 paper books. And going through that, I would recount memories. It would take me back to the past. It would reaffirm part of my belief in who I am and what I believe in and how I operate, and so on and so on. And it would also give me an opportunity to go back and to look at things and see how they've changed. And then I would sort of, operate, you basically, at the time you work in half digital, half paper, and you make some notes and you go on the web on your laptop or your computer and you type things up and you work that way. And then suddenly all that went completely. For a moment, it's like you don't have 3,500 books. And my library has grown since a little bit. So you think, okay, it's sure they're all surely there. So then I had to think, okay, how do I organize them? How do I gain access to all that knowledge? And as I did that, using the different versions of software available to me to actually do that over the years, I've played on their strengths. I found ways to cross-reference them. I found ways to basically keep all the notes current. I found ways to create ontologies, if you like, of all the different subjects across different domains. So suddenly, if you do that, that extra layer of thinking overlays an entirely different layer of knowledge. And suddenly you see things differently because they're a lens. So that process itself absorbed me. And then slowly it remade me, if you like, because it changed my perspective. And then I thought, right now I don't miss my library. It's like an older version of me, which I can barely remember. But if I step into that version, I can fully relive the magic of actually having a book or having, a big library. You sort of look around and you sort of arrange the volumes by size and by color and you think, should they be arranged by subject or, whatever. And that's amazing. It's an amazing thing. Practically, I can't do it anymore because, I don't have the space, I don't have the setup, and there's not a single bookshelf in my house. So I'm fully digital, and I fly into the domain knowing that every time we make a transition, we always lose something for the things we gain. And I've told myself, okay, I'm fully prepared to pay that price.
One more thread to tug on related to that direction, that chain, whatever. Would you say that was driven partly out of, again, you strike me as a guy who you're very purposeful and intentional about personal transformation and pursuing shifts and changes. Was it somewhat driven by that, or was it impacted by your research? Because I just, having read some of your work and knowing the depths that you go research and interview wise, I'm guessing some of the people you were talking to and the things you were looking at could have also influenced that decision to go digital.
It was purely practical, to tell you the truth, because I was so linked and wedded to that version of me that loved books and loved owning them and loved having them and rearranging them. And, that's your hobby. You go down, you think on the weekend, what am I going to do? The sci-fi section, for instance, I'm going to rearrange that. And as you do, you step into the past. I think that's glorious, amazing, it's magic. And okay, it doesn't happen now. So, the practicality was that. And once you make the transition from a practical point of view, then you think, okay, I've got two options now. One, I can say, okay, I did it and I'm doing it reluctantly. I'm half embracing it and I'm wallowing in self-pity because I lost half myself. Or you can say, hey, this is a new world. Sure enough, we lose something, but what does it have to offer? And that's exciting. Suddenly I thought to myself, okay, how can I organize all this vast knowledge that exists there to actually serve me better? And I can use it better. And that was a challenge because, initially in 2010, the software was rudimentary, to say the least. And now it's so much better. So that was a challenge which I used to sort of drive me on and continue to drive me on. I continue to uncover things on how to do it.
Let's jump into your drive, your curiosity. I was looking through some of your recent articles just to get some ideas for our conversation today. And I pulled a quote from one of them. I think this is one of your most recent Sunday articles. You have a line in there that says, in retrospect, my professional writing career has plumbed the depths of information, philosophy, and human behavior to deliver insights that help us better understand what to do. This becomes next to impossible if we first don't understand why we do things. I want to go there in a minute, but I'm curious, like for you, where does this curiosity drive stem from? Is this something that emerged in you as a child? Where did this endless curiosity first come to light? Or have you looked back and be like, oh gosh, this is where I became crazy curious? Where did that start?
Actually, I have. And then I find myself, the older I get, the more I think of, why am I the way I am? Why isn't everybody this way? Why are people different? And without having an absolute answer to this one, essentially what I'm sort of gravitating towards is that we all have this curiosity for the world. This is how our brain is actually hardwired to operate. We are curious, and the more we learn, the more we sort of understand how to operate. That level of operational safety, or surety, if you like, allows us to create a certain sense of certainty. And our brain is really hardwired to do one thing only, to allow us to accurately predict the next moment. And if you can do that, then you can say, okay, then I can keep you safe, and that's my job done. So everything we are, it comes down to that one thing. Our curiosity, our social structures, our complexity, our decision-making are all designed for that. As we're young, we actually hardwired to do that. And at some point, we become sort of set in our ways. Not that we stop being curious, but we become more afraid. We become conscious of that fear. You say, okay, I'm okay now. And if I go to the next stage, maybe I won't be okay because I'm uncovering things I can't deal with. I'm uncovering new knowledge that I don't know what to do with. I can see more things, and those things create uncertainties. And whoever needs that, right? And I totally get that. And for me, again, it was never really an option because I traveled a lot, and in my life I've changed now 4 countries and 3 continents. So you can't say I've really put down roots anywhere in the classical sense of the word. And that has created an inherent sense of insecurity, if you like, in terms of, I don't have the usual structure that people have around them. So I have had to create that for myself. I have had to be what you might call perceptive by joining dots that normally wouldn't be joined, by being more anxious about things which people perhaps wouldn't be anxious about, which has given me insights, which then allows me to dial down that sense of anxiety. So if we take my own unique dysfunction, that's been my strength in terms of what I do.
Yes, make our weaknesses our strengths. Maybe that's your superhero bent there. Back to that quote I shared a little bit ago. So what do we do and why do we do it? I feel like in some sense where you went in the sniper mind, you helped us to figure out how to make better decisions and how to better cope with what the world was throwing at us. I feel like when we gain a new tool set, it helps us fix things that are at the surface. But also I feel like as some things get fixed, we're freed up to feel some of those tensions, some of those difficult places where we're like, I'm so good here and here, but man, I'm a train wreck here and here still. What in the world? So I feel like you peel back a layer of the onion, or you put a Band-Aid on this spot, and then you're freed up enough emotionally to go, oh, wow, why do I do this? Why do I still struggle here? I kind of feel like that's sort of a lifelong process where the what and the why, and we might be great one area and struggling in the next. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, it doesn't necessarily have to be what you've learned personally. I mean, it could even be, how does this work out practically as you're dealing with organizations and structures? Because you not only see that with individuals, you see that within companies and families and other kinds of structures. Like, how have you seen that played out as you've been researching and thinking through that sort of stuff?
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, now I'll give you 2 answers to this one. One is kind of more conceptual and one is more practical. And essentially, when it comes to us, or it comes to any kind of organization or entity that we set up, we are sort of seesawing between 2 things. We're seesawing between complexity and complication. And some people use this interchangeably as terms, but they're actually quite different. Now, if something is complicated, it's simply difficult. It has some kind of a multi-layered sort of structure. And all we've got to do is basically break it down a little bit so it goes on a step-by-step process. And if it does, and if we do it correctly, then the complication goes away. It may take us a little bit of time, but a little bit more effort, but we can actually deal with it. If it's complex, it means that it has layers which we can't see, and those layers have impact which we can't foresee. And that's what makes it so difficult to deal with, because we approach it in a certain way with a certain belief, perhaps, or a certain assumption. It turns out to be that, but then we get to another stage, and then it's an entirely different world. And then we have to deal with that. We have to analyze it, see how we can break it down, and how to deal with that. And given infinite time and resources, of course, anything can happen, and anything can be solved, but we never have infinite time and certainly never have infinite resources, and that's the problem. So this is the reality that we actually live in now, whether we are individuals, ourselves, you already said we solve something, but then we see something else. Then that something else troubles us, trying to sort that something else out. Then we realize something entirely new, which completely throws a curveball, and we have to deal with that. Going into companies now, how does that actually translate into real life? And I'll give you an example without naming the company. But essentially, I was in there to talk about search and search marketing. I talked to the marketing team, I talked to the guys doing the search, I talked to social media teams, and it transpires that sometimes they work at opposite ends of the scale, so they're actually competing with each other. Sometimes they don't have the information they need because there's an information bottleneck. And you say, okay, guys, you're working for the same company, you all want the same thing, so what's the problem? The problem transpires that, there's a sense of distrust between teams and team leaders. And you think, okay, why is that? And team leaders themselves have different sort of targets, and they have different turfs, and they have different budgets. And those budgets actually compete, because if your budget is bigger than mine, then mine can't be as big as it was, kind of thing. It has to get smaller. So I'm struggling for that. So then you think, okay, here's an example in practical terms of everybody wanting the same things, of ultimately the company itself wanting to have a bigger market share, better margins to work with, bigger bottom line. And then the infrastructure that's set around work is actually not designed for that. Or if it was designed for that originally, it is no longer fit for purpose. And no one's looking at that. And you think, okay, it gets done to me, and I make some suggestions, and the suggestions trouble them, and they go back and forth and think, maybe we can change this, maybe we could change that. Then we find ourselves doing a workshop on trust as opposed to search, because we find that's the real problem. But that's the complexity of human behavior. And how do we deal with that successfully? Well, in my experience, there's only one way, and that is you have to keep an open mind, and you have to believe, truly believe, that we're designed to be good. We are designed to cooperate. We're designed to actually work harmoniously together. And when that doesn't happen, it's not because somebody's being obtuse on purpose or somebody's actually being evil. It's simply they haven't got the same picture we have. They haven't got the same information. They might have slightly different priorities, which create their own pressures for them. And unwrapping that riddle is how we learn to actually connect at a very human level and reach the compromises we need, which allow us to cooperate. And that's our secret superpower, really. Cooperation makes us stronger.
So you're like David Amerland, marketing consultant, part-time psychologist, counselor.
Yes. And it feels that way sometimes. It really does. Because when they come and say, and I hear that so often, the company invests, if we have a workshop, for instance, and usually they tend to be global. So, executives travel from all over to a central location. I travel there. Everybody's expenses are covered. So there's a huge cost. They're away from their desks. So they're costing the company money in productivity. So it's a huge investment. And we all agree on the targets. We all agree what we actually achieved. We all agree what we learned. And they tell me, okay, we're going to go back now. And everything new we suggest, the answer is going to be no. And already you can feel him deflating a little bit. And, that's the point where I have to say, look, it's organic, right? If you can't convince them after I've convinced you guys, then it's not convincing enough. And I think about it, okay, this process where we go one step forward, two steps back, well, it's the way it should be.
I think any lasting change, when you're trying to overcome structures that have been in place for multiple decades, and in some companies, hundreds of years, if they're a really well-aged organization, if you will, I feel like it's a fascinating time for so many companies and so many industries right now. We've got 4 generations in the workplace right now, which creates its own unique set of opportunities and challenges as the baby boomers and the Gen Zs struggle to understand each other. And I feel like the Gen Xers and the millennials, we're all in the middle trying to help navigate and translate between the generations. So that is interesting. And then the other thing I really feel like is a challenge right now is whether we're talking education or corporate structures, so many of the things that are in place today maybe worked great when we were in more of a manufacturing society or worked well 70, 80 years ago. But the needs of the current workforce, how society is shifting and changing so fast, I feel like so many of our structures, they're just not set up to cope with the dynamic reality of work life today. It's a different world. Many people, many organizations, we struggle just to try to stay on top of the little things, let alone these macro changes that feel like you're just asking us to hack off an arm and a leg and sort of try to function in some new way. How do we fix that, David? How do we fix it?
Well, you've articulated the problem really well. And here's what it is. It's a very modern problem. It's very much the change or the shift, if you like, from the 20th century to the 21st. And you say, what's it like living in the 21st century? Well, obviously we have better technology, but that's not it. We have better information flow. We have greater transparency. And all these things combined create a context collapse situation where the clear divisions of the past, which told me and you exactly who we were, which allowed us then to define what we're going to do and why, they've disappeared. So suddenly, you find yourself working next to people who are a lot younger, people who are a lot younger work next to you, you have different priorities, and they kind of meld and merge. You have different points of view, and they have to kind of work together. And you perceive things differently because you have different experiences and different memories. And that means you have essentially different micro-realities sort of clashing with each other or, working next to each other. And they have to also somehow be made to work harmoniously. The way we do that, of course, is communicating. And we need to communicate better. And when you think about communicating, there are several problems there. The first one is having a common language, which means that you need to kind of agree to certain cultural realities. And if you're coming from different cultures, if you're geographically apart, if you speak different languages, if you come from different ethnicities, for instance, this is harder to actually be made to work than it sounds. Then you need to learn to use the kind of language that allows the other person to understand what you mean, even if it's complicated. And that means you need to To be empathic. You need to get into their point of view, get into their situation, and actually think, how do they see it? Okay, this is how I'm going to say it then, so they understand how I see it. And then that allows us to do that. And that's really difficult because we have to, in our head, model two different realities. We have to be empathic in order to do that. And that creates complexity in terms of the modeling that we need to create, the information we need to have, the grasp of realities that we need to have, and that makes it hard. And then the other thing, of course, is that when we communicate, beyond the communication, which is purely communication value in the words that we use, we are also using words to either elevate ourselves or degrade or denote somebody else, because language is also a social tool that allows us to establish a position in a social hierarchy. And that allows confusion to come in, because if I sort of use the kind of language that suddenly has made what I said, however simple it may be, sound really grandiose and amazing. And then I've taken what you've done and I've sort of given a sort of really low kind of value by saying, that little job you did for us last week, and that little job might have been, a project that took you 6 months to finish and actually present. So then that ego thing kicks in, which again comes back down to identity and understanding of who we are and what we want to achieve. And that creates its own entirely different and sort of overriding a level of problems and complexity. And that's why we see these things. This is why all these things are happening, and they're happening everywhere. You go into a company, you have that. You go into sort of local setting like a town or a city, and you see that kind of problems arising. When you have a population of perhaps 10, 20,000 in a town, you think, this is easy. A township, easy to run. No, it isn't. You go into a city, that's difficult. You go to a country setting where you have politics, and again, the same thing happens. And we get the current situation. And all these things are happening because they have to happen, in my opinion. We are seeing problems which we haven't yet got easy solutions that we can apply to. And we need to work them out. And we will. It just takes a bit of time and effort. So this is part of the process, if you like, of living in the 21st century.
I'm going to redirect us into a totally new direction. Any books or research, like what have you been reading? Like what's been interesting to you or anything that sticks out you've read research or book-wise in the past 6 months?
I've been doing a lot of research and interviews. And when I do that, I usually read sort of research papers, and I read books which are highly technical. For my own sort of sanity, I tend to read fiction. And I've read recently a book called The Name of the Wind. And I'm trying to remember the last name of the author, and I think it's Rothfuss, but I can't swear to it because it's difficult to pronounce. But the book is amazing. He's basically created a very detailed, granular world. And I found myself reading it at the same time to different levels. I allow myself to really enjoy it and think it's brilliant and the way he sort of draws you in. And at the same time, I'm sort of deconstructing the way he did it because, it starts off very slowly in a very almost mundane way. And he lulls you into a false sense of security. This is like a very familiar scene, especially the opening one. And it takes you in and you think, I understand this. And then suddenly it becomes a bit more complicated and tension begins to ratchet up because things don't quite add up and something else is going to happen. But seeing how he actually did that, and it took him, I think, about 6 years to write that book, it makes me appreciate the thinking that he actually put in that. And also from the research of my previous book, The Sniper Mind, I know the way that neuroscientifically, fiction writers have to work on two different levels, where they basically are highly empathic. They use that empathy to create and totally understand the different reality that they actually are depicting. And then they have to kind of come back like reporters almost and create that reality for themselves. And they have to be truthful to the picture they imagined. So I'm really appreciative of that. And every time I read it, and I've almost finished it's another volume out now. So I've almost finished the first one. It's part of a projected trilogy, but he's only written 2 books. So I'm hoping you'll finish the third by the time I finish the second. I'm kind of really appreciating the skill, the ability, the focus, the dedication, and the work. And that helps me relax mentally.
Obviously, with the types of interviews you're doing, and you said you're reading research papers, you live in a very nonfiction-oriented world. And even for me, like I work in the Christian publishing space, but the majority of what I'm working with, whether it's for prepping for an interview or things we're looking at for work, it's all nonfiction. And I would say for me, I read very little fiction, but there are a handful of authors there where those books are kind of an escape, and it tickles something in my brain and ignites a creativity in my mind that is completely like dead dormant and sleeping as I'm reading 30 nonfiction books a month or whatever it is. For you, is fiction kind of, on the one hand, sort of an escape, but it also sort of unlocks a different part of your mind?
Yes, it does. It does both. I mean, obviously it's an escape. It's a decompression valve. So, I get into his world and suddenly I find myself actually feeling concerned about the lead character and the things he's actually doing. And I'm thinking, I know it's an irrational thing. You think, this is fiction. It has nothing to bear with reality, but I keep thinking about it. And that completely sort of takes the pressure off from the other things I do. At the same time, I'm thinking, okay, that's amazing. How did he do that? How did he make me feel such concern for the character? Because, he didn't tell me, hey, David is some guy you identify with, because it's not, right? But how did he do that? And then going back and looking at all the pages and how he did it, I think, wow, that's real magic. And also you appreciate the skill of the writer, right? I highly recommend this book. It's called The Name of the Wind, and it's really good.
Well, I'll link that up in the show notes for the episode. And whether it's a film or a book, I feel like when you can, obviously I don't sit and watch people reading books, but I had an experience last spring. I was at this Christian media event and they were premiering films that were coming out. And the latter part of the film, it's the big climactic scene. And people were like literally getting up out of their chairs and cheering the character on and just go, go, go. And we're so excited. And I was like, I've never seen this before. And I didn't particularly like the movie personally, but I was like, okay, the filmmakers did their job. They captured the hearts of the entire audience to such a degree that they all stood up and were cheering this character on, like it made a difference in the outcome of the movie. And so, whether that's in a film or like you're describing in a book, like I just finished reading book 6 in this series that I'm working through, and I don't get to read book 7 until next fall, 2020, which makes me really sad. But I'm so invested after 6 books in the characters. Where like I was tearing up as they're encountering these emotional situations. I'm like, this is silly. Like this, like you said, this is no bearing in reality. Yet my heart is just so connected to these people in the book after 6 books. And and like you, I do like to think back, like how did they accomplish that? I feel like it illustrates a sort of level of mastery of a craft where you're like, oh my gosh, if they're able to just tap that part of my emotions just by the scene I saw on the screen, or what I just read in a few chapters, they've really done something special. And that's not every book, not every film. They're not able to do that.
Agreed, absolutely. And neuroscientifically, we actually know that the moment a book resonates like that, the circuits of the brain that light up, that make decisions about right and wrong, about structures of the world, about what's important, how we get meaning, how we connect with people, how we are actually more human, if you like, they're exactly the same as if we are actually living in the real world. So in a sense, we are able to do a lot of things. We can, in a safe environment, because it's entirely fictional, in our heads, model an alternative reality and actually reach some conclusions which we can apply to our own. At the same time, it's play, because we're almost trying things out to see how it is. You're thinking to yourself, the character had this choice and, he had this temptation. And in his shoes, what would I have done? Why? And then you're thinking about it. And that allows you then to make sort of a value judgment about your own values, about your own priorities. So essentially then you're recalibrating a little bit of who you are in terms of, hey, maybe I've been a bit too practical and I should be a little bit more ideological perhaps, or the other way around, depending on how you see it. And that allows us, the fictional element in our lives, the narrative, allows us then to refine the narrative which we tell ourselves, which creates our identity. So we become better people because of that.
I think that's one of the brilliant and kind of beautiful things about a lot of Patrick Lencioni's work, like his book, Death by Meeting and Silos, Politics, and Turf Wars, where not all of his books are like this, but the majority of his books are written around this fictional story. And he's teaching you new things, new concepts by usually following some leader through this whole transformational journey. It's really, he gives you a hero's journey that you get to go along on, but he's always teaching you something very practical on the other side of it and throughout the book. And so I think that's an example of where it's extremely intentional, because he's trying to teach you business skills or communication skills. It is interesting how it almost bypasses some of our defenses and teaches us something. All right, totally new direction, David. Any tools or gadgets that have been game changers for you in the past 12 months? So anything that's changed your life or been particularly, you're like, wow, where were you a year ago?
I've been using them now extensively for the last 3 years, maybe 4. I've sort of get more and more value out of them. And I've used them consistently. I use 3 things. One is Google Keep. And I use that as a kind of a diary on the go. I make notes, notebook on the go, whatever. And I use that. And I sort of just pile everything there. I can search for everything. And I keep my lists and everything. And they're available on any device. And I love that. Then I use Evernote. And I've actually... I went on and I appreciated what they do, and I went and subscribed to their premium service, even though at the time I didn't use it very much because I appreciated what they do. And, the cost is not huge, so it actually made sense to do that. But I've actually used them more and more now, and I'm using them essentially to create a notebook about a book I'm writing with ontologies, with research, the works. So essentially there's a massive support structure which contains the book which I'm going to write as I'm writing it, if that makes sense. And I must say that without them, I wouldn't be able to be as organized as I am, because I have to fit in interviews, I have to fit in research papers, and then I happen to come across other things which I hadn't been looking for, and there's a serendipity factor sometimes. And then those things have to actually go somewhere or be made to go somewhere which will be of use in the future. And this is where Evernote has come into its own, really, because I can essentially create a very complicated structure around my book and put everything in, and it begins to make sense after a while.
In terms of how you use Evernote, are you using tagging, or is there anything you're doing specific or special with labeling and categorizing things to make it more useful for your project?
Yes, I definitely use tagging in every notebook, and every notebook is a book. But then within that notebook, I can have sub-notebooks, if you like, where I basically have almost, and that creates a lot more depth. And then I can sort of, as things change, or I can reprioritize things, or I can see something clearly, which I couldn't before, and then I can sort of reorganize the structure a little bit. And then that allows the book I'm writing to actually make sense, because there is that structure which has a logical sort of progression that allows me to say, here, you cover this in this chapter, and the next chapter is that one, and that's going to lead into that one, and that one has to be there, and here's all the research supporting that. It's been invaluable to me. I think if it wasn't there, my books would suffer in terms of the quality of the structure they have, and quite possibly the writing, because at the end of the day, the writing is only as good as the structure of the book. And the third tool I've been using is Google Drive, and I've been keeping notes from all the different books which I have on Google Books there. So as I go through each book, I make a lot of notes. I highlight things, I keep notes, I make mentions of other things. And what happens, they automatically go on the web, on Google Drive, and they're the notes which relate to that particular book. And then if I could do a quick search, they come up. And then if I then want to sort of restructure them and put them somewhere else, I can just copy and paste and they go somewhere else. And then I find myself with a file which has a specific subject and the references from, maybe a dozen books, which then I need to refer to other things behind them. So it's the rabbit hole syndrome. I create more rabbit holes for myself, but it makes sense in terms of the way I think and the way I approach things.
Well, what I find kind of intriguing is, the three tools that you shared, they're all very representative of your digital life. Because you're a writer, because you do research, it all culminates in the cloud. I think for the, just being familiar with some of your materials, having read this Sniper Mind, I think you'd probably drive yourself crazy if you tried to organize everything you have to organize on paper, because the books you write are rather complex. It's not like you're just doing this simple dive. I mean, if you had to literally write all that out by hand, it'd take you 25 years to write a book.
Yeah, it wouldn't work. You're right. It just wouldn't. You're quite correct in what you're saying. I think it's an emergent phenomenon. I think the books which I write and the way I write them are only possible because of the way I can organize the information that I find. And then also the way I can chase the different rabbit holes that information points me to. It's like having a faster car. I've got a faster car with a bigger engine. Suddenly the distance to the next city, which hasn't materially changed, is not as long anymore. So, you might find yourself spending weekends there. And if you spend weekends there, you might find other opportunities which you couldn't. And that's what it is, right?
In terms of categorizing and tagging, do you find as you're going back and looking over things that you've already sort of finished taking notes on or research, that by labeling things, sometimes there are associations you never realized were there? As you go back and look, you're like, oh, I tagged this, and this the same. I would have never connected those two. Do you have these kind of epiphany moments where you're like, oh, wow, there's a correlation there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it happens all the time. And a lot of the times, because, the research can take me up to, usually the average book takes me 3 years from beginning to end. And there's a lot of research that goes in the background, a lot of interviews, and infinite cataloging and recataloguing. So you find that, you've forgotten about some of the things which you encountered on year one. And as you sort of going through your notes and you're coming up, you think, look at that. That happened that year, and I found that, and I found this. And then you think, why was that connection made? And then you sort of look at it, and then suddenly you have a moment of epiphany because it allows you to see something deeper and bigger, right? So yeah, it happens all the time. But it's a digital world. Information is inert. It has zero value until you can provide context. You can only provide context if you have some kind of intent. And that's the conscious effort that you put into something because it has value. So the moment all these things come together, then everything changes again.
One more rabbit hole to go down quickly before we wrap up, David. We're nearing the end of 2019. You advise people on marketing. I'm curious from your perspective, state of marketing as we enter into 2020, what's important?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that. And really, my answer is going to be a little bit of sort of anticlimax, but maybe not, because essentially what is important to us in any kind of marketing context, in order for us to make a connection, in order for us to trust somebody, and without trust, there's no relational exchange of any kind taking place. We need to feel that there's that human spark, if you like. Somebody's actually listening to you and they're valuing you as a person with a need, as opposed to a prospect with a dollar sign. So in order for the dollar sign to materialize, that prospect with a need actually needs to happen. And increasingly since the year roughly 1990, we've been focused on the new shiny, quote unquote. And the tools we've had have actually been the focus of our marketing efforts and our efforts in branding and so on, because they were new and we were enamored by them. And we forgot the human element. We sort of still hope to scale, press a button and make millions of sales, put a logo and put it up everywhere and it works. And none of this now works. What really works now, our technology is so powerful, so ever-present, so omniscient, and it's only going to get more so, that it has virtually become invisible. So what we need is that contact. I do business with a brand and I give them my money. I need to feel that brand represents values which actually reflect who I am. I talk to you and I give you my knowledge freely. I need to feel that you're a kind of person that actually understands that knowledge, will use it, will spread it, will actually have some kind of meaning instead of going into some kind of void. So that personal connection, that human spark, is basically, essentially, what we need to solve in a digital environment where it's always on. We are watched by everybody at every point, where the context changes with a fluidity we can't always predict, and where all the things which do, the compartmentalized things which we do, suddenly happen in the same domain. It's a massive challenge. It forces us to be authentic. It forces us to be less transactional when we know that the value of most of the things which we do are transactional. It forces us to be more value-driven when we are uncertain about the monetary value of value. So these are challenges which are essentially human. They come down again to identity. They come down to who we are, which then will define why we're doing something, which will determine what we have to do next. But in order to think about these things, we actually have to be introspective in a much wider, broader context, sometimes in much deeper context than we have ever had to in the past. I very much doubt that working in the 1950s, for instance, workplace would ever bother with this kind of thing. All we had to do is keep our head down, keep our nose clean, and, put in our 35 years and get our pension and go home. And it doesn't work like that anymore. So this is the challenge of today. And then how do we do that? How do we do it when everything's changing all the time? How do we do it when the context changes? How do we do it when, you live in the States, now live in the UK, and you have totally different experiences, totally different political reality to mine. You almost speak a different language, and we still have to connect. We have to make sense. We have to work together, perhaps. So this is the challenge. At a human level, if we're to meet over a cup of coffee, in the course of an hour, that can be sorted out. We don't have that. And on top of that, you have your pressures, I have mine. So if we think of all this on a global scale, it's a massive problem. Can we solve it? My feeling is yes, we can, absolutely. The question here is we need to actually try and solve it sooner rather than later, because later has our back against the wall.
I feel like there's so many different forces that press on different sides of that conversation, because on the one hand, I have to almost view my potential customer as a person. Really, I have to start viewing them as a person with needs, and they're real and they're tangible. I might need to get down in the trenches and actually connect with that person in a real way, which is very different than our traditional marketing and advertising, where we're behind this mystical curtain and we just throw things out and hope they see them. So I feel like that's one part of it. I feel another side of this conversation is there's just an overwhelming number of choices. It's not just one brand of toothpaste. You go to the toothpaste aisle at, say, a Walmart or a Target store here, and there's 50 different kinds or 100 different kinds of toothpaste. How in the world? I just want to brush my teeth. I don't need to have bubble gum and licorice flavor and whatever else. So I feel like there's a choice overwhelm kind of a challenge. And then I feel like another component to the conversation is we are, as individuals, because of social media, we are all marketers. We are all portraying this persona. We talked earlier about I perceive you as one thing because of what I see from you online and how and you probably perceive me as sort of in one way. But almost everybody is putting things on display for others to see. And that's where I think somebody identifying with your brand comes into play. Some people might get the tattoo of your logo on their arm, not all of them, but in a sense, by you sharing it on social media, they're giving social proof to me, like I am aligning myself with this brand because it makes me feel like a better person, or they're a brand who they live out my values, and so I want to be seen as aligned with them. So I feel like part of the challenge for this conversation is there's all these different forces that are sort of steering different elements of it, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And that's, again, the balance, complicated and complex. Sometimes it happens to be both, which is, the worst of all possible worlds. And the only way to navigate all this, absolutely the only way, is to be human, to be us. Now, why us? Because Oscar Wilde said, be you, because everybody else is taken. But there's a practical reason for this. If we truly are us, if we're truly authentic, the amount of effort involved in being who we are immediately goes down because we're consistent. We don't have to rethink it every time. If I was trying to project a particular type of persona, let's say, and for you especially, I would have to think really, really hard now, and I'd be really struggling and be doing it. And then let's imagine I have another interview after you. Then I have a different kind of article which I need to write, or I need to project a different part of myself. Okay, all that kind of effort would be so labor intensive from a cognitive point of view, or so energy intensive, I should say, from a cognitive point of view, that it would be unsustainable. I couldn't then be me for more than a day because I would break down, right? And that's why authenticity is so good. That's why being who we are, it's the right thing to be. And that's very human. That's the thing we need to trust, if you like.
I feel like I'm not going to say it's totally a modern challenge, because I know people have always had challenges when it comes to identity and what other people think about them and all that sort of thing. I just feel like it's so much more acute and felt these days, because we're worried about, oh my gosh, I've only gotten 4 likes on my Facebook post, or nobody's seen this Instagram post. What in the world? Oh my God, I'm failing as a human being. And so I feel like sometimes with the stuff that we focus on, not unlike our marketing, where we're like, oh, it's all about the numbers. How many page views has this have? How many people have clicked on this? And, never mind if we're being completely inhuman. I feel like as individuals, we can also struggle to get stuck in the metrics of it and lose the reality of the need to be authentic, the need to be real and relational. And not to say metrics aren't important. They do help us make good decisions. But when we dehumanize it to the point, whether that's as individuals or organizations, where all we care about is the metrics, then we're losing, because it's awful. Who wants that existence?
Exactly. That's, again, focusing on the tools, because, as we move forward, we actually have better and better tools on measuring the material impact of what we do in a digital world, and also increasingly offline. So we can actually track to a good extent these days human behavior from online to offline and back to online again. And that gives us a very exciting picture. Suddenly we can say, I can see this. I can see if I did this, that person did that. And then what do we become? We have the illusion, because it's illusory, of actually controlling people through the things which we do, which we can to a narrow extent, but we can't to a global extent. And then we also have the illusion that we are so powerful in our ability to do this, that it works everywhere regardless. And okay, the truth is, it's not really what we're seeing, because people are complex. So though we're seeing them in a very narrow context, that's not the totality of who they are. And the other thing is that in a global context, it's an unsustainable approach. Sure, we have metrics, and definitely things which we do when it comes to very specific things like a campaign or so on, we need to do everything we can to measure as much of it as possible so it's accurate and we know that it works. But before we even launch the campaign, if our thinking and our intention is wrong, if we think of, for instance, clicks, people, dollars kind of thing, instead of, value, needs being met, then, our approach is going to be wrong, and ultimately we will be disappointed. This is why so many campaigns fail. What makes sense on a spreadsheet doesn't always translate at the human level. And again, that's a challenge. How do we do this in the corporate boardroom where, somebody will say, but yeah, look at the bottom line, look at the quarter sales, the targets you have for the quarter. And, I totally get all that, and I see it in action. At the same time, I try to move the needle a little bit to the fact that, ultimately we're all people and we're dealing with people, and everything we do comes from people in their actions and intents and needs. And that's what we need to address.
All right. It's almost time for us to wrap up, David. What's your final word? What's your final piece of challenge or encouragement you want to leave with our listeners and our viewers today?
Admittedly, the world we live in right now is really complex. Everything that we see, almost everything that we see, challenges our perception of who we are, what we do, what's the right thing to do. The most difficult part in all this is to be open-minded, be willing to embrace change and challenge, and then try as much as we can to be ourselves at a very human level in what is essentially a non-human domain, the digital world in its complexity. And that's what should be challenging us every single day. And if we tackle this on, we can't really go wrong.
David, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. Fun, fascinating conversation. For the listeners, the viewers, if they want to find out more about you, your work, your books, where are some of the places they can connect with you on the web?
You can find me at davidamerland.com, where I put in a wide variety of things that catch my interest, as well as practical things in our value to businesses and marketers. And also these days on LinkedIn and on Twitter at David Amerland.
Well, and like we do with every episode, I'll put some detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with David, places where you can pick up a copy of some of his books. I'll also link to our interview about his book, The Sniper Mind. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with David Amerland. Again, for more on David, a great place to start is his website. You can find that over at davidamerland.com. And David, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you back on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.